Alright, now that it's dried, we're going to take this apart, see what happened. So these were those black marks I was referring to earlier. That we'll need to scrape off before we send it through the planer. So if you want to, you can take a palm sander and hit those down a little bit more. I have to do a little bit of planing on this side. It's fairly flat, but or fairly smooth, but I'm going to have to go down a little bit in some places. I always find students using a chisel on this part. It's usually not the best for the chisel unless you have a sacrificial chisel in your shop. But otherwise, if you have a sharp one, it's going to ruin the edge on that. So I'm going to flip it over, and if it has a wobble in it, that's more than 1/8 inch, you usually want to hot glue it to a flat board and run it through the planer first. This one, I actually don't feel any wobble in it at all, so we're going to head straight to the planer. These red ones are about a 1/2 inch higher than everything else, but since there's so few of them, I'm going to do a full turn on the planer each time until I get down close to the height of the other wood, and then I'll start doing my half turns after that. So now that I've planed it down on the planer, the common idea is to take it to the chop saw to cut your end square, but the chop saw isn't as accurate as a slide or as a sled on the table saw, so we're going to use the table saw. It's also a little bit better of a blade, so it's not going to chip as much. At this point, I could make my own little profile, so I could make some curves, some freehand curves around here, and give it quite the artistic flair just by putting in some curves right there. But the truth is, on this one, my wood is so close to the top on all these points that it's going to be easy enough to just cut it off and have a rectangular cutting board instead of trying to make some sort of profile. I'd actually probably sacrifice more wood trying to make a profile out of this to make it look right, because I'd be cutting the corners back. So I'm just going to cut it square using the sled here. So now that I've got a fairly rectangular board, I'm going to go ahead and router it. And a lot of times students will get pretty excited about this step, and they'll get some very fancy router bit to do their edges, but oftentimes it ends up turning more like a plaque than a cutting board, which, I mean, if you want a plaque, that's great. But I found that with those deep grooves, if you have a deep groove router, oftentimes any oils or from whatever you're cutting will get caught in those grooves. So I find it's best just to use a roundover bit, and so far it's worked pretty well. We're going to sand right after this, so you don't have to worry about all the marks ahead of time. So now we're going to sand the cutting board down, get all the grooves left from the planer or whatever marks you have. If you have a wide belt sander, this is the time to probably use that as well. There's going to be some burn marks probably left over. If you want to hit those with a file first, take them out quicker, that's probably a good idea. And then you're going to want to start with, if you just went through the planer, depending on how nice your planer is, usually you want to start with a 120 grit and then bump up to 220. You can start lower if you need to, and you can go higher, but as soon as you get over 220 grit, you're not going to really feel the difference with a cutting board. It's kind of a little more than you need to do. So I'm going to put 180 on mine because where my planer is, I'll just probably start with 180 and finish there. It really doesn't need to be more than that for a cutting board. If you have real bad nicks or something on the edge, this is another time to put some glue in there and fill those voids up. So if I had any gaps in between my boards, I can wipe some glue in there and then immediately pull off any extra and then start sanding, and the dust from the sanding will mix with that glue and it will slightly fill those voids. Now, you can't do it with big gaps. I have a knot right here and it's got a little void in there. I'm going to do it with that. It's about a 1/16 inch diameter and I can probably get away with that. Make sure you wipe off any residue because if it's too much glue on top, it's just going to gum up your sandpaper and then you've thrown away 50 cents. When you start your sander, always start it on the machine or on the piece of wood and then turn it on, and when you lift it off and then turn it off. So put it on and turn it on, lift it off, turn it off. That way you don't get extra marks in your board. there's a lot of different kinds of oil you can put on your board afterwards. They make a combination mineral oil and beeswax, which is probably one of the better ones, but it's more expensive too. You can get by with just mineral oil. It's one of the cheapest, and whatever you do, don't put anything like olive oil or regular kitchen oil on it, because it's going to rot in there, and you want this to be food safe. So the mineral oil, or if you have the money, the beeswax mix is a good one. When you put the mineral oil on, this is laxative, and so it's food safe. So you're going to use just your hands. I found if you use gloves or if you use a rag, it gets more on the glove and more on the rags and less on the board. So you're just going to pour a dollop on there and then spread it all around with your hands. Try not to put it back on the board afterwards. People get really worried about the oil, and so they get cardboard or something, but the more that gets on the cardboard, again, the less that's getting on the board. So it's best if you just pour it on there and then go for it. I've got some empty cans here. I'm going to throw these on, or just about empty, so I'm not going to quite get enough this first couple go arounds. This will really bring the color out. It's really going to make your board look good usually when you put this on. And unscrew the cap of your last one before you start oiling your board up. It's going to soak in mostly on the end grain, so make sure you get a lot on the edges of the board, and you're going to let as much as you can soak in, and then probably you're going to wait a day and then come back and try and get some more to soak in there. The more that soaks in there, generally the better. Usually you want to re-oil your board about once a month or so if you can. A can like this at Walmart is going to be about $5 or less. So that's going to last you a couple of years if that's what you're using it for. And make sure you do both sides at the same time. I've had students oil only one side of their board and then come back and find out that it's cut that direction. So try and make sure you oil everything at the same time you're doing it. It's okay to have extra oil on there, you just don't want too little. Once you get done with this, I just have my students lean it up in their lockers until mostly it soaks in, and then they can come back the next day, put another coat on if enough has gone in there. So now that the top and bottom is done, I'm really going to put an emphasis on trying to get as much as I can on the edges, especially the end grain, where it's going to soak in the most. And if you've been following along, cutting board's done. Let it soak in for a while, and good to go. When I got done sanding, I made sure that I couldn't see any pencil marks, any burn marks, and any marks from the table saw. That's usually the biggest one, is leftover table saw marks. You can see the circular pattern in the end grain. That's hardest to get out. Also, you may have noticed that I sanded on the edges. That's where your table saw marks come. I have a problem with students doing that though, because a lot of times they can't hold the sander flat, and when they can't hold it flat, they tend to round one side more than the other, and then you get some weird shapes on the edges. So if you're going to sand the edges, just be real careful. And then also when you're sanding, if you have a mark in your wood, I've had kids just sit there for half hour before trying to get down and get a mark out, and then you're left with a big old divot in the board. So it's best to plane the whole thing down to that height, whatever it is, rather than trying to dig out something with a sander. It looks better to have a thinner board, unless you go less than 3/4, and then you're asking for trouble. If you're following along, congrats, hope your board looks nice.